Good morning. Welcome to Thursday Morning Torah. There's a lot going on in the world this morning. I suppose that's always true, although we're not always aware of everything that's going on in the world. But we are now. I just, for those of you who are watching right now in real time, I just checked the Jerusalem report because the Jerusalem Post, I'm sorry, which I check regularly, and also I write a column in. So I was looking, and they said that there's a report that a ceasefire is about to be declared. I hope that that's true. We all hope that that's true. And it is a difficult and frightening time. And in such times, rather than subject you to yet another discussion of the thing that everybody in our community is talking about, let's go to the Torah and talk about that. And in particular, I think what I'd like to focus on this morning is actually the haftarah. Now, for those of you who are not clear on this distinction, allow me to explain just for a moment so that you know what it is that we're talking about. The Torah, in its narrowest definition, because there are lots of different ways you can use the word Torah, is the 5 books of Moses, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The rest of the Bible, all the other books, are broadly speaking part of the Torah, but they're not part of that Bereshit to Devarim, those first 5 books. And so the Torah is what's called a step canon. A canon is a group of sacred books. A step canon is a group of sacred books ordered according to the degree of their importance, holiness, the degree of reverence with which they are held. So after the first 5, there's Nevi'im, the prophets, which actually include historical books and prophets. So it starts with Joshua, and then Judges, and then you get Samuel and Kings, and you also have all the prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, so on and so forth, and Isaiah. Then don't want to leave out Isaiah. He is in some ways the biggest. And then you get, and the 12, what are called minor prophets, because they have smaller books. And then you get to the third part of the step canon. Remember, I said there was 3, and that's the Ketuvim, the writings. And the writings contain all those other books, like Esther and Ruth and Proverbs and Psalms and Daniel and Song of Songs, on, Job, that are not in the other 2 categories. That's why in Hebrew it's called the Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The Torah, the prophets, the writings. I bring all this up, apart from its intrinsic importance, I hope, because when you go to synagogue, and you have somebody reading from the Torah, the bar bat mitzvah in their portion almost always then reads from the haftarah, and the haftarah is a section taken from Nevi'im, from that second part of the Tanakh. So you'll read the section from the Torah, and then you'll read some section from the historical and prophetic books, and that's the haftarah. This week, the haftarah is from the book of Judges, and it's about Samson. And the story of Samson, like many of the stories in the book of Judges, which I encourage you to read because it's some fascinating stories, the story of Samson is a particularly well-known and interesting one, and has a lot, I think, to say to us in some important ways, and that's why I want to talk about it this morning. So, first of all, in order to describe what Samson is, other than strong, which everyone knows, but he wasn't always strong. What happens at the beginning of the story of Samson is one of, to me, the most gripping and interesting phenomena in the Torah, in the broader speaking, the Torah. And that is, an angel comes to Manoach's wife. Manoach is a guy, we don't know anything about him yet. to Manoach's wife. She's not identified by name, but the angel comes to her, not to Manoach, and tells her she's going to have a child. And when she tells Manoach this, he's terrified that they're going to die because they saw an angel. And she basically says to him, if we were going to die, the angel wouldn't have appeared to us, would he? And you get the sense that the brains of the outfit is Manoach's wife. But then Manoach says something, asks a question that is a beautiful and poignant one. It's one of those cases where somebody, almost in their ignorance, asks a question that is deeply meaningful. Sometimes little kids do this, right? They pull you up short with the profundity of their questions that comes out of simplicity. Manoach says, will the angel come back and tell us what we are to do with the child who is to be born? In other words, ask the question that every parent asks, what do we do with this child that's about to be born? And what they eventually do is they encourage, they make Shimshon, Samson, into a nazir. A nazir is a category described also in the Torah of somebody who dedicates their lives, sometimes permanent, semi-permanently, usually for a period of time, to God. And there are three essential rules. You can't have alcohol, you don't cut your hair, and you don't come in contact with a dead body. And that's a life of dedication to God, a nazir. Now, the rabbis had a somewhat ambivalent relationship to the idea of a nazir because they felt that it wasn't clear that such self-denial, also denial in various other ways, is actually spiritually healthy. But having said that, Samson becomes a nazir. But Samson is not constitutionally built for a life of devotion to God. Samson is much more like one of those heroes of Hollywood or Greek myth. He's a sort of prodigy of appetite and physicality. And he grows up super strong and takes women right and left, sleeps with prostitutes. It's clearly, explicitly said in the Torah, which is not something that you hear a lot about biblical heroes, right? Don't remember that with Moses. Don't remember that with Abraham. But Samson does. Kills people who oppose him. The famous with a jawbone, he wipes out of a donkey. He wipes out thousands of Philistines. He sets fire. He captures 300 foxes, ties their tails together, puts fire between them, and sets fire to the fields of an enemy. He is an impulsive, powerful, undisciplined example of somebody who is tremendously gifted physically, but is not gifted with impulse control. You know, the phrase, the flesh is willing, but the spirit is weak. Or the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Well, Samson is the opposite, right? The flesh is willing, but the spirit is weak. He's a spiritually weak person, an impulsive person. And yet, as you may know, he's chosen by God. So the question is why? And what do we learn from him? And what does it have to do with the Torah portion? So Samson, as you may know, meets this woman, Delilah, and he falls in love with her. But he doesn't tell her the secret of his strength. In fact, he deceives her a couple of times. And each time she has, like he says, I have to be bound a certain way. They bind him and he breaks the binds. And he doesn't catch on that she's his enemy. He just thinks she's testing his love. And so finally she nags him. And by the way, if you read it, it's clear she doesn't seduce him into telling her the truth. She nags him into telling her the truth. He can't stand it anymore. He goes, all right, it's my hair, leave me alone. At which point Delilah hires a barber. It's not Delilah, it's a barber that cuts Samson's hair, which is not generally the way people remember the story, but it's the way the story goes. And it renders him weak and unable to fend off the Philistine hordes that then come for him, place him in the temple, make a mockery of him, this great hero of Israel. And then eventually, of course, at the end, he prays to God for a renewal of his strength, and he pulls down the pillars of the temple, and the people inside it die. Now, what's the lesson of this story? And I don't think there is a lesson, but there are a couple that I want to suggest to you because they explain why such an improbable character, such a really unadmirable and wild man would be chosen by God and would be included in the Tanakh and would be remembered. So the first lesson here, which is part of the lesson of the book of Judges, if you read the book of Judges, there are any number of judges who are not exactly upstanding, let's put it that way. Yiftach, who sacrifices his own daughter in fulfillment of a promise that he ought never to have made. He says, by the way, just in case you don't know what the promise is, and again, I do urge you to read the book of Judges, but he says, if I win the war, whatever first comes out of my house, I'll sacrifice, because people kept animals in their house. First thing to come out of his house was his daughter. But obviously, the rabbis think that's ridiculous. You don't do that. But Yiftach is one example. Samson is another example. And part of what this tells us, which is really important in the Bible and important in general, is that God can use all sorts of different kinds of people for God's purposes. They can be flawed, they can be cruel, they can be, that you don't have to be a perfect person to be able to serve God's purposes in the world. Now, there aren't that many perfect people to start off with anyway. So that idea is one very powerful idea that the Samson story tells us. The other is that the Samson story illustrates the Jewish reality of what is visible and what is intangible, because Samson is all about the material, the physicality, the strength, the power, the so on. But of course, Judaism is not about that. Judaism is that the greatest reality and the greatest power is that which is intangible. It's not like Moses is praised for being strong, or Abraham is praised for having a lot of stamina. They're spiritual heroes, not physical heroes. And along comes this guy, Samson, who is a physical hero, and it doesn't work. And the only thing that saves him is his conversion to spiritual heroism at the very end. That matters because Judaism is making a point, especially, by the way, even though it precedes Greek culture, it's almost making a point against Greek culture, that the worship of the physical heroism that characterized so much of pagan culture too, and Greek culture, is not the Jewish way. That you can be a great hero and a nerdy guy who spends his time in a lab discovering a cure for a disease. That this Samson image, even though we have one in our tradition, is actually not. There's no physical description of Moses in the Torah. We don't know what he looked like. I mean, he could have been short and fat and bald. Doesn't seem that way, but could have been. Moses could have looked like Danny DeVito. It could still be Moses. And the reason that there's no physical description is that that's not actually the essence of who Moses is. Moses is someone who has a spirit, a towering spirit. And that's what matters. And therefore, Samson is offered as a sort of ideal counterexample to this. Now, I want to say that this is actually really important right now, because nobody wants to underemphasize the centrality of physical strength in this world. As I said at the very outset, I don't want to spend a lot of time right now on the conflict in Israel, because that's all we've been spending, like literally night and day on in 100 different ways, and it is exhausting. God knows, not as exhausting, I mean, as those who actually have to endure it, and we should feel enormously grateful that we don't have to endure it, but also very proud and supportive of those who do. So I'm not trying to complain, boy, the war in Israel is really tough on me. But the lesson of the importance of physical strength is not lost on any of us. And we know what it was like when the Jews didn't have physical strength. However, they did not survive because of physical strength. The Jews didn't make it 2,000 years because they were physically starkers, as my grandmother would say. Starker means somebody who has a lot of physical strength and resilience. They survived because they were spiritual starkers, which if I ever write a history of the Jewish people, that'll be my title, The Spiritual Starkers. Because they had this enormous strength of spirit, and that sustained them even in times when physicality failed them. And you see this again and again and again. And the story of Samson is in some ways intended to provide the counterexample. And part of this is yes, I think what Alana said is true. He takes his strength for granted. It comes too easy. The other thing that I want to say is in the Parsha itself, in Naso, about which the Samson is the haftarah, in Naso, the Torah says that the nazir cannot be defiled by a corpse. That makes it tumah, impurity. And the reason, according to Samson Raphael Hirsch, that a corpse defiles, and the fact that it's the av tumah, the most defiling thing ritually, is because if you look at a physical body, you might come to the conclusion that the body is all that exists, that we're just bodies. And that conclusion is against, obviously, the spiritual center of what Judaism is about, which is that we transcend the body, that we're more than a body, that bodies, after all, are what are our temporary dwelling place, but they're not our permanent home. And so the idea that we are bodies alone is an idea that sort of flies in the face of what our tradition wants to teach us about human beings and about spirit and about life. And therefore, Naso and Samson make a nice combination in that way, because it reminds us that in a very material society, which is what we live in, where we are surrounded by stuff and where we are encouraged to get more stuff, and when there is a surfeit of stuff in the world, that ultimately life is not actually about stuff. I've had the experience, and I suspect some of you have, not only with my own parents, but especially talking to other people's parents. In fact, just the other day, I spoke to someone about this. They're cleaning out their parents' house, and they realize that in a lifetime, their parents had accumulated just an enormous amount of stuff. And no one really wants all of that stuff. And the only thing to do is to get rid of it, because eventually that's what happens to all stuff, right? I mean, things that we think of as important may be important for a generation or two, but eventually, they all go. And so the material possessions that we think of as so important to life are actually very ephemeral and not what matters most. But here we still tell the story of Samson. And the story, of course, is immaterial. And the story itself is a spiritual gesture. And that doesn't disappear. And so the idea that God is the greatest reality and the least tangible reality, not something that you can touch or see, not only stands at the center of the Torah, but in some ways stands at the center of this story about Samson that we read this week. Now I'm going to take a short commercial break here and just tell you that as of now, there are 2 rallies planned in support of Israel on Sunday. I'll be speaking at both of them. One is begins at 11 o'clock in front of the Federal Building on Wilshire and Veteran, and the other is in Beverly Hills, and that begins at 3 o'clock. And whether there is a ceasefire or not, and I hope there is a ceasefire, there is still a struggle for part of the soul of America that is going on right now in terms of Israel. And the days in which, as you know, and I say this with pain and with sorrow, the days in which there was an automatic assumption that all the major figures in right or left would be supportive of Israel, and that all Jews would automatically be supportive of Israel, those days are gone. I don't know forever, but at least for now. And therefore, those Jews who are supportive of Israel and believe that it's important that it have strength and that it endure, you don't have to agree with everything Israel does. That's not a prerequisite. It's never been a prerequisite for being supportive of Israel. I hope you'll show up. I hope you will make your voice heard. I hope you will write to your congressmen, senators, any elected representative or public figure that you think can hear your voice, because our sisters and brothers in Israel need us to stand for them. And we're the ones who have the great privilege of being able to live in a world where there is an Israel and do not have to pay the price. So I hope that you will join me at the rallies and that you will speak up. And again, it is not so far from the story of Samson himself, which is that in the world, if you don't have physical strength, there is danger from those who would oppose you or from enemies. And if you don't have spiritual strength, you have nothing. You have nothing. Because remember that, again, just to repeat the central lesson, it was when Samson showed that he had no spiritual strength, that he wasn't even strong enough to resist nagging, that he lost his physical strength. It's why Rabbi Nachman says despair is the greatest sin. Because if you despair and you lose your spiritual strength, you have nothing left. But thank God, the Jewish people retains its spiritual strength, and the state of Israel retains its physical strength, but we have to help it as much as we can. So I hope that you will. And I think Samson is a good model to keep in mind for what we need, what we are in danger of losing, and how we can help. So I want to thank you for joining me for the Torah class today. And I hope to see you Shabbat morning. I hope to see you at the rally on Sunday. And I wish you a good week, and Shalom al Yisrael. Peace on the land and people of Israel. Take care.